cover the American West in the late 19th century. The objectives are to identify key terms and events, examine the economic and social changes of Western lands, and understand the impact of Western expansion on Native peoples. After the conclusion of the Civil War, Americans turned their attention to Western lands that they claimed following the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War. They long held dreams of creating new cities, planting new farms, and extracting raw materials from the vast territory, but conflicts over slavery, taxation, and internal improvements dominated U.S. politics during the antebellum era. Also, building new communities so far from the urban industrial centers of the eastern seaboard was impossible without the right technology. In order for settlers to succeed, they needed to be able to communicate with far-off places, have access to goods and services they could not produce, and ship their products to market. While the nation lacked these things before the Civil War, they emerged stronger, more organized, and equipped with the tools to turn their attention westward. To examine the American West in the late 19th century, we will begin by looking at federal support for settlement, then turning our attention to transportation and technology. Next, we will examine urbanization and economic development, followed by Native American relations. The Lincoln administration did not wait until after the American Civil War to promote Western settlement. Prior to the conflict, sectional interests prevented the passage of a liberal homestead law that would open the vast western lands to settlement. With the southern states in open rebellion, congressional Republicans passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which President Lincoln willingly signed. It granted 160 acres to settlers for a $10 fee. All that the federal government required was that the applicants live on the land and improve it for 5 years. At the end of that time, the land became theirs for the small price of processing fees. The conclusion of the Civil War coincided with a renewed increase in immigration from Europe. People poured in from Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe looking for a fresh start. Many joined the trains of settlers to public domains in the West, hoping to take advantage of the new homesteading law. Men, women, and families tested their endurance and skills in carving out a farmland of their own, once occupied by Native Americans. Life on the Great Plains was difficult for many settlers. Wood, water, and stone was hard to come by in many places. Cities were distant and had limited services. Moreover, Native American resistance to American encroachment on their lands continued throughout the late 1800s. In these circumstances, homesteaders struggled to build successful farms. They usually spent years living in sod houses. The rugged homes challenged women who were tasked with keeping them clean, warm, and stocked. For individuals, days of solitary living could challenge their mental health. It was not for the faint-hearted, and many failed in their efforts. Regardless of the difficulties, the homesteads successfully attracted settlers west and helped to expand the country. Transportation was key in attracting settlers west. The long distance between urban centers located in Washington, California, Colorado, and Utah served as a daunting challenge. The Oregon Trail, California Trail, Santa Fe Trail, and myriad other routes west took months to traverse. Shipping goods between eastern and western coasts remained largely a maritime affair. Entrepreneurs had tried to overcome the obstacle of distance. Butterfield Overland Mail, Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express, and the Pony Express were all efforts to make overland mail and passenger services cheap and efficient. While they captured the American imagination, they never overcame the obstacle of distance. For cattle ranchers, the solution to getting their product to market was the cattle drive. Herds of longhorn cattle roamed the state of Texas, ready for any willing rancher to conduct a seasonal roundup to brand newborn calves. For those less lawfully inclined, a method of increasing stock was to steal them from Tejano or Mexican ranchers. Once they had a large enough herd, they would undertake the long drive to market. Early cattle drives took stock from southern Texas to Sedalia, Missouri, where it was then shipped east. As railroad lines extended westward, so too did the cattle drive destinations. The Sedalia Trail was later followed by the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail. Railroads were the key to settlement, though. They alone held the solution to overcoming distance. Since the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, there was a lingering desire to build a transcontinental railroad. With Southern opposition silenced during the war, Northern and Western states took action. They passed the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, authorizing the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroad companies to begin constructing the Transcontinental Railroad. The Central Pacific began laying its track in Sacramento, California, while the Union Pacific began in Omaha, Nebraska. They met at Promontory Point, Utah in May 1869. The venture was made successful by generous land grants and loans made by Congress. The companies could rely on government loans of $16,000 per mile for flat land, increasing to $32,000 and then $48,000 as land elevation increased. Congress also awarded the railroads alternating tracts of land on both sides of the track. These were the railroads to sell to would-be settlers and town boosters. Between the generous land grants of millions of acres and low rate of loans of millions of dollars, the railroad became a profitable investment for the companies and a model for future railroad construction. New technology and improved transportation and cheap lands led to a rapid increase in the population of Western territories and states. This helped create a process of urbanization and a developed economy, especially through the technology that made this possible. Barbed wire appeared as a cheap solution to enclosing and protecting farmlands in 1874. Windmills allowed farmers to pump groundwater. Repeating rifles and six-shooters gave individuals greater protection. And these small inventions were later dwarfed by larger ones. The McCormick reaper and other agricultural machinery vastly increased the productivity of Western farmlands while reducing the need for manpower. This made cities like Chicago, Illinois, the new metropolitan regions of the American Western lands, as they served as hubs for agricultural, livestock, and raw material products that were being extracted in Western lands and shipped east. Gustavus Swift introduced the refrigerated car into the meatpacking and shipping industry in 1877 as new cattle breeds replaced the inferior Texas Longhorn. This made the American West basically the new ranch for the entire nation, producing the country's proteins and meats. Silver and gold mining booms and busts also continued the tradition started by the California Gold Rush and the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, attracting new settlers to upstart cities like Tombstone and Deadwood. Before long, mining, ranching, farming, and transportation activities gave rise to new urban centers like Laramie, Topeka, Bismarck, and Cheyenne. Through all of this activity, the Native Americans were there fighting to retain their lands and their cultures. During the 1850s, federal government formulated a new policy for Native Americans known as a reservation system. Whenever the federal government purchased land from Native American tribes and removed them to other federal government purchased land to other areas, the new policy called for them to resettle on reservations. There, agents would monitor their compliance with the treaty and act as an intermediary for the federal government. The Native Americans were guaranteed a small allotment of food and supplies to help transition them to new land. Moreover, the Indian agent had a staff of blacksmiths, farmers, educators tasked with teaching the indigenous people American farming and building techniques. The idea was to contain them on the reservation and assimilate them to American culture. Initially, the Lincoln administration sidelined Native American affairs to direct the war effort. However, tensions increased in the Great Plains during the war. In the 1850s, the gold rush drew miners, farmers, and urban boosters to Colorado Territory. The increase in Plains traffic led to disagreements and quickly war over land and resources with the Cheyenne and Arapaho living there. Affairs reached their nadir with the Sand Creek Massacre in eastern Colorado on November 29, 1864. The northern Great Plains erupted in war. Texas had already been under increased attacks from their long-time rivals, the Kiowa and the Comanche. Construction of the Bozeman Trail following the Civil War further inflamed the situation by bringing the Sioux firmly into the fight. The Confederate defeat allowed the United States to turn its attention west. Following the Fetterman Massacre of 1866, the U.S. Army sent troops under General Winfield Scott Hancock to the west with mixed results. Faced with war weariness back east and charges of inhumane treatment of Native Americans by reformers, the newly elected Grant administration took a different tactic. The peace policy began in 1869. Grant turned the administrative control of Indian agencies to religious denominations. The idea was that they would treat the Native Americans humanely and avoid the corruption that plagued the Indian Bureau in the past. The idea was peace on the reservation, war off. The process began with the Grant administration sending emissaries throughout the West negotiating treaties with the many Native American tribes. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek was an example of the new negotiating style. The commissioners and their military associates drew together the prominent leaders of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Kiowa, and Kiowa Apache. In return for land concessions, the tribes were promised supplies, a staffed agency, hunting rights, and perpetual title to their remaining territory. Similar treaty efforts took place throughout the western lands. Peace did not last. It quickly became apparent that the United States wanted the Native Americans to assimilate to American culture and abandon their traditional practices. Reservations were often located on marginal lands that made survival challenging at best. American citizens did not always respect the treaties, nor did the federal government enforce them. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1874, miners and other settlers looking for quick wealth streamed into Sacred Sioux territory, resulting in a revival of hostilities. Moreover, not all Native Americans agreed to the treaties. In the southern plains, bands of Comanche led by Quanah Parker refused to go to the Fort Sill Indian Reservation. The result was a renewed assault on Native American independence. The federal government, state and territorial governments, and railroad companies promoted the widespread hunting of bison herds to reduce the Native American food supply. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army made use of innovations in military technology and transportation to refine their tactics. By the 1890s, Native American armed resistance came to a close, and another chapter began as they tried to preserve their culture in the face of boarding schools and dwindling reservation lands. The settlement of the American West was made possible through the conclusion of the American Civil War, the development of new technologies, support of the federal government. It produced new urbanized regions in former Native American lands. It opened up new markets and new sources of raw materials to an industrializing United States of America. With the close of the Reconstruction era, the American West helped usher in a new period of industrial and economic prosperity for the United States of America.